The Arab Awakening, and moderating it will be Griff Witte, who is from the great class of 2000. We also have on the panel Amaney Jamal, who is a professor here in politics and the director of the Bobst Center for Peace and Justice. We have Thanassis Cambanis, who came all the way from Beirut, so appropriate place to come from for this theme. Who is an MPA 2000 and is at the Century Foundation. Barbara Bodine, who is an integral part of the Woodrow Wilson School. She runs our Cincy program and is a lecturer and is the former ambassador to Yemen, U.S. ambassador to Yemen. And Hady Amr, who is with USAID and also an MPA alum. So thank you very much. Before we start, I do want to say a number of our panelists have written books in recent years on these topics, and so we will have a book sale at lunch. Everything else is free. I have to sell books. I get no proceeds from this. I'm just doing it to be helpful. And David Sanger, who one of his books, which recently came out in paperback, and he'll sign them, and perhaps some of the authors will as well. And some of the authors may not even know that we're selling their books, so look for them. I think you're one of them. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out here today. It's my privilege to be on such a distinguished panel. We have a true rock star ensemble here, and I think our expertise really spans the breadth of issues in the Middle East and geography in the Middle East. After such a robust conversation in the previous panel about Syria and the question of will Bashar go or won't he, will the U.S. intervene or won't it, I figured we could shift the focus a little bit and focus some attention on the countries where all of this began, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, the countries where there has been an overturning of the old order and a new order has begun, and the question becomes how different is the old order or how different is the new order from the old. We have 5 people up here on a panel about making policy, but only one of them actually makes policy. Hady Amr has that privilege. And I'll start with him and just ask, what are the underlying issues of the Arab Awakening that the U.S. government, through USAID, is trying to address, and how are you addressing them?
Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be back in this auditorium where I studied 20 years ago. But I want to mention, so I want to go back a little further to answer your question. Exactly half a century ago, my mom, a New Yorker, was one of a half dozen women that came to Princeton as one of the sort of critical language studiers for a junior and senior year. This is when Princeton was an all-male school, as some in here may recall, if you were here back then. I mention that because my mom was part of the American baby boom, a sort of this massive group of people that traveled through American society and transformed cultural, political, social, and economic norms in the U.S. And right now in the era, and I will answer your question, just sort of going about it in a sort of long-winded way. There's a massive group of people that tip the scales for business, the government, media, academia in the U.S. And the same thing has just happened in the Arab world. The massive change that we've seen in the Arab world that has really changed social, political, norms and expectations is really what's driven this. And so, the baby boom combined with social media, decades of authoritarianism, economic malaise, at least for ordinary citizens, has really driven the Arab Awakening. And so those essentially are the issues that we at USAID, as the development arm of the U.S. government, are trying to address through our $1.6 billion of assistance to the Middle East, not even including $400 million that we're putting into Syria, so $2 billion in assistance. And so we sort of bucket the 3 or 4 areas of work that we do into three or four areas. First is sort of trying to address, especially in countries like Libya and Tunisia and elsewhere, inclusive economic growth. So not just looking previously as in sort of how economic growth was for the sake of economic growth, but is growth inclusive for ordinary citizens? Second is sort of pushing transparent and accountable government and sort of looking at that, sort of address dignity issues, democracy, and then looking at education, human and natural resources. So that's sort of what we are trying to do across the region. I will note, if I was sitting here 2 years ago, as the Arab Spring was beginning, we did not have operations in Libya. We did not have operations in Tunisia. We were not trying to, support the humanitarian situation in Syria. So what we've done is we've reacted by developing programs in all those areas, and I can get into further details in the questioning, but just wanted to open it up in that regard now. Thank you.
Thanassis, you spend a lot of your time in the Arab world reporting on the ground there. Do you see the impact of those efforts? Do you see U.S. influence in the region? Do you see the U.S. being a major player there?
I mean, I see the U.S. as a shrinking giant. I don't think there's much debate anymore about whether the U.S. has a direct influence over governments in the region. I think it's been answered that we don't, and I think the U.S. remains the single strongest outside player. I mean, I don't think there's another superpower that has as much and as broad a regional influence. But gone are the days, if they ever existed, where the U.S. could dictate to its partners or allies or client states in the Arab world. I think we're grappling with that unsuccessfully so far, but we're getting better. How do we find and use levers of influence with the Egyptian government and the Egyptian military? Nobody's great at it. We probably bat below our weight. And sort of, the running question is, how can we give the Israelis $2 billion a year and they don't do anything we ask them to? How can we give the Egyptians $2 billion a year and they don't do anything we ask them to? Of course, it's not so simple, and that's not exactly true. They do a lot of things we ask them to. They don't do some that are important, and we don't do some of the things they ask us to as well. And it's a negotiated relationship. Since the uprisings began, and I don't like to call it an Arab awakening because it sort of implies that the Arab world was this sort of dormant corpse and it woke up in 2010. If you use the word uprisings, it leads to more organic understanding of this as a phenomenon that is that's going to last a generation and that is very unpredictable. But the U.S. is trying to negotiate these incompatible sometimes interests, and this came up this morning. When Bill Burns spoke, when we talk about promoting democracy and promoting regional stability, sometimes those are completely at loggerheads. I mean, these are not. Sometimes, you have a lucky trifecta where you can promote all three at once. In Egypt, time and again, this is a terrible trade-off that we're right now helping push Egypt in a terrible direction once again. Because we interpret this incorrectly, I think, but we interpret this as a trade-off. We want a secure border with Israel, between Egypt and Israel, and the Egyptians always fool us by saying, "Hey guys, you gotta let us, torture people or have a, zero due process or no judiciary if you want us to be able to keep the Sinai quiet. We want to help you on this Israel thing, but you've really got to turn a blind eye to our authoritarianism." And it just happened again in November after the Gaza war, when this administration, I think, kind of ham-handedly and clumsily and ultimately they regretted it afterwards, said to Morsi, "Hey, you did great on that Gaza thing for us. We love you. We're surprised. We're surprised that you weren't a crazy Islamist. That was awesome." And the next day, he came out and suspended the Constitution. And it took a month or more before the U.S. government said, "Wow, that wasn't so much in our interest, and we didn't have to give you the green light on it. You might have done it anyway, but we didn't have to sit in your corner." And we're learning. We're learning. And the other thing we're learning is this idea. There's a kind of stupid binary that gets applied all the time to the Arab world by U.S. policymakers, in this case, one of the key stupid binaries is this one between two: Islamism, secularism, and democratic or authoritarian. And of course, we know from looking at political behavior that these are continuum. There's a continuum, and every political organization has traits of both. And especially in democratizing context, there's a lot of there's regression, there's interplay. You can't describe the Muslim Brotherhood as one or the other. I mean, they contain all four of these things, and when they behave in an authoritarian way that runs counter to our interests, we should use our bully pulpit against that. And there was this really naive American policy voice in the last year that said, hey, these guys are Democrats. They are elected, they have legitimacy. Let's help them learn and see what they do. And there's an almost condescending framework to that because, they're a powerful group. They just took power. They're going to behave as powerful groups always do in their own interests. They're not kindergartners who are going to learn democracy and and legitimacy is an abstract concept. Power is what actually pertains on the ground. And I think we're starting to speak the right language, or U.S. policymakers are starting to speak the right language. I don't think they've really gotten ahead of the game and started to think about the unfolding politics of the region dynamically and trying to sort of get ahead and shape it.
You mentioned that false binary, and now we have, of course, an Islamist government, a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government in Egypt. You have democracy, you have elections, you have people voting and making their voice heard. I think that there was a lot of false optimism 2.5 years ago during the protests in Tahrir Square. There was a sense that Egypt was headed in a much more liberal direction. And I wonder, Amaney Jamal, what you would say about what happened to those liberal voices? Where are they? Are they still there? And what are they saying?
Well, of course, those voices are still there. So let's put things in perspective. I'm of the mindset that things could be a lot worse in Egypt today. We're 2.5 years out from a transition, what's supposed to be one of the first regime transitions since World War II. This is a region where we've had a lot of external intervention that favored stability over democracy, an intervention that basically ignored public opinion at the expense of stability. So right now we're really moving in this new terrain where we're experimenting with what democratic governments might look like. So you look at the conditions of Egypt, it was a regime on the verge of economic collapse. Yes, there was some economic growth under Mubarak, but this was a very highly indebted regime. This was a regime that was almost completely dependent on outside actors to sustain it. It was authoritarian, it was repressive. There was never a culture of political participation. So in many ways, the fact that Egypt hasn't fallen apart, I think, is really quite an accomplishment. If you look at all the other democracies which have evolved, whether they're in the former Soviet Union, with the bloc of the former Soviet Union, whether from our own history, the U.S., France, other countries, it took them several decades to transition to full-fledged democracy. So the jury's still out on where the Egyptian government is going. However, I do want to, so again, there's this issue about liberal voices versus non-liberal voices. There are liberal voices in Egypt. My sense is that those liberal voices have always been few. And this is not to say that, not to put these on a normative dichotomy and say, everything that's good in the world is liberal and everything that's bad in the world is not non-liberal. I don't want to step into a normative debate here. Again, you remind us that 30 years ago, women weren't allowed to be students at Princeton University. And we're one of the champions of liberal values across the world. So we have to keep everything in perspective. Now, the problem with the liberal movement in Egypt is that it remains very much an elite-based movement of a handful of individuals who never really dialogue with the masses or the citizens of Egypt, right? They're not on the streets, they don't mobilize, they speak a language that is quite foreign to the vast majority of Egyptians on the street. So they dominate the airwaves, but above and beyond that, they don't have much leverage or credence on the ground in Egypt. So that's a big issue. And I think this is going to be a big problem, not only for Egypt, but for all liberal movements across the region, is that if in this aura of democracy, where democracy means mobilizing public opinion and mobilizing people and listening to people and getting their votes out, they're going to have to come out of, the five-star cafes and be on the streets mobilizing individuals. Otherwise, there is no liberal movement in these countries.
Can I jump in? So I've spent most of the last 2 years in Egypt writing a book about revolutionary youth and who organized Tahrir Square and what they've done since. And I actually think there's a facile element to that critique about these liberals in the cafes, because a lot of them are not in the cafes, and a lot of them are working class people. And they have failed to galvanize a huge public following. It's not because they're ordering $5 lattes in Zamalek, all of them. Some of them are.
Most of them.
I don't even think most of them, and a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them have been continued to be arrested and tortured and held without due process under the SCAF and under the Muslim Brotherhood government as they were before. And what is happening in Egypt, and I think it's tremendously exciting and of limited impact so far, and a generational thing, is politicization for the first time. So at the beginning of Tahrir Square, you had people who never felt like their political voice mattered, finding that this protest that they organized, that they thought was a quixotic sort of arrow in the dark, brought 1 million people out in the streets and toppled the dictator. And they were euphoric and transported by this newfound sense of power. In short order, they realized, they had been chanting, the people want the fall of the system. Well, the system did fine. The system rebounded and persisted without, hardly flinching. The dictator was gone, and the military was still the single most powerful institution in the country. What we've seen now in the 2 years since is the slow and painful process of politics being created with a lot of systemic resistance. I mean, it's not just that the liberals are fractured buffoons, which many of them are, but it's that there's a lot of money and resources being spent to make sure there isn't a non-Islamist political space of import in Egypt. So that's one thing. Another thing is that, what are the actual popular ideas in Egypt today? They're not liberal, right? I mean, they're Islamist ideas that are very popular that come from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is also an elite bourgeois movement. The most popular populist movement is the Salafis, and they have a huge following on the street, and they are, I would say, normatively horrible, anti-liberal, anti-growth, anti-modern. And then in the secular space, there is a very popular Arab nationalist revival. And Hamdin Sabahi's showing in the presidential race was a manifestation of that. And these are sort of militant Arab nationalist, anti-minority, indifferent to Christian rights or hostile to them. And they're not, they're not an appealing building block towards a pluralistic, open, rule of law-based liberal society. But there's a lot of movement there, and in all these spaces, and this is the thing that we can't forget, there are smart, young people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, some of whom are professional, some of whom are working class, who are organizing little movements and medium-sized movements and joining political parties and trying to climb up the secretariats of these groups. And they will, for better or for worse, they'll be the powerful political generation 20 years from now. And I think they will be certainly more representative and more diverse than the ruling class of 3 years ago. I don't know if they'll be liberal, and I don't know if they will be inclusive and pluralistic, but they will mark a huge change.
But can I just finish on that thought? So the two things I just want to kind of leave us with is, for the longest time, the public opinion of the populations weren't heard through any of these official formal channels, whether democratic or otherwise. That's the first thing. So this is very much a new experiment. Second of all, we often say that the Islamists, minus the Salafists, but the Islamists themselves are a monolithic movement. That's not true. There's a lot of variety and diversity and variation within the Islamist camp right now. I think the Muslim Brotherhood itself is trying to reformulate and figure out where it's going to come out on a lot of these issues, both economic, social, politically. There's a lot of divisions within the movement itself. And then the last thing is, we talk about liberal values, and again, I want to come back to that, and I think a lot of those liberal values are important for a sustaining democracy. But it's in my opinion that when we look at public opinion data across the region, and if we think that liberal values is going to be a prerequisite to Western or a Western democratic system of governance, we don't have that package of liberal values in the region across the board. Yes, we have some activists, we have some youth, but the liberal values and the way liberal values evolved, even in Western societies, was due to a process that involved economic development, it involved political development, it involved things were really bad before they got better, before we started respecting minority rights and women's rights and things of that sort. And so if we think that the Middle East is going to adopt and become liberal overnight without those experiences and without having the ability to see the harms of not exercising policies that are dehumanizing and whatnot, we're wrong. So I think we're going to see an illiberal phase before it gets better, if we may.
Barbara Bodine, I want to bring you into this conversation. And we've talked a little bit about how political Islam has changed the region or is changing the region. But I wonder how political Islam is being changed itself by the transformations that we're seeing. How are movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood, how are the Salafis, how are they morphing into perhaps something different as their role in society transforms?
That's a great question. And I would like to underscore what Amaney said, that it is far from a monolith, both within Egypt and within the region. And in a number of countries, I look more at the Gulf states and Yemen, there have been legal Muslim Brotherhood parties or groupings in a number of these states where they've been able to contest elections, hold parliamentary seats, otherwise engage in the political space. And includes Kuwait, Bahrain, a little bit of some of the other Gulf states. Yemen has had a legal Islamist party for over 20 years. And what we've seen is that when they are brought into the political process, Jordan, Morocco too, sorry, is they tend to have to become either pragmatic or die. They have to start delivering services. They will win elections. If they don't produce, they lose elections. And so it has a tendency to, I'm not going to say that it either moderates, I'm not sure what liberal means in many cases, but it does make them far more pragmatic when they have to compete within the political space. And what we've seen in a number of places is that they're willing and able to. The other side of that is that in those countries where they have competed in a relatively open political space, there seems to be about a 20-25% limit on their real popular support. It may spike in the first election after a transition because they're the only organized group, but then it tends to sort of kind of drop back down to about the 30. The last point on sort of just political Islam writ large is looking at the Gulf states, which tend to be far more conservative. And I'm not even really quite sure, again, how you're defining Islamists. I asked a student in one of my classes, and I see a number of my students here, so hello. You've heard some of these stories before, just be tolerant. That we were debating in class what exactly an Islamist is. And she's Muslim American, and her answer was, basically on some level, everybody in the Middle East is an Islamist, in the sense that they want their religion, their values, their culture reflected in their political process. And this is this sort of takes Amaney's point and takes it even broader, is that as we're dealing with this part of the world, we are going to have to understand that some part of a dialogue amongst the people, amongst the Muslims, on what role Islam plays is going to be a fundamental part going forward. We talk about secularists, there's very few, real secularists. But there is a debate about how far it comes into the political process, how far clerics come into the political process, and all of that. But even when you're looking at that, if you look back on Islamic history, even among the Shia, there's a quietist tradition, where again, Islam might inform laws, rules, society, but don't get directly involved in politics. And even among the Sunni tradition, there was kind of a separation of church and cleric. And so I think this is going to be a long, ugly, difficult dialogue, one that we're going to have to be sensitive to, not insert ourselves into. But I think the long-term prospect is certainly better than before, and can finally settle out into something that's going to be an Islamic form of democratic governance as opposed to maybe democratic government.
Can I say something?
Please.
So, I actually wrote a piece last year called "We're All Islamists Now," but I'll disagree with it and with.
Okay.
I think that first of all, we have to remember that some of these countries we're talking about, like Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, are not Muslim countries. They're Muslim majority countries. And in a place like Egypt, where 10% of the population is Christian, and where a sizable chunk of the elite actually is secular. And so they are Muslim believers who want a secular state.
Yes.
They're not a huge chunk, right? But they're not the 1% that you would find in other places. Those are folks whose rights are incompatible with the system that is Islamic. And so when you have a majority that wants a Sharia-based legislative vetting, for example, and Islamic rules as they interpret them for the constraints on the political system, it's incompatible with the rights that these other groups see. Now, so the other thing that I think is really important to bring up, and we can all disagree about this in a minute, is there's a big problem with an analysis that asks what happens to Islamists in power or what happens to anyone in power when we're talking about systems in which there isn't actually power sharing in the political system. So in Egypt today, we had a transition from a government dominated by essentially Mubarak and the army and the police to a system that is now being wrested over by the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. And there's actually nothing in that system that requires anybody to share power or negotiate legislation with anybody else.
Right.
So it's not a question about someone moderating or changing their ideology. Right now, it's a contest for power, and for the time being, the system goes almost entirely to the person who can dominate it, unless that system is redesigned and re-engineered in such a way where an elected party will have to make compromises no matter what it is.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to have, so it's not a question of will they be pragmatic. Everyone's pragmatic, and they're pragmatically seeking maximal power. And that's a quandary that I think, unfortunately, we have little effect on, but we would love, we meaning the U.S., to see some structural incentives for people to have to share power.
I don't disagree with you, and particularly on Egypt, which I will admit is a country I never served in, as I leave it to others. But I was making the point, in some Arab states where they have been able to operate as legal political parties in the political system over years. A number of scholars who follow it much more closely than I, like Nathan Brown, have pretty much concluded that it does tend to make them far more pragmatic as political players. Egypt has not reached that stage yet. There's a number of other political steps they have to go through. But if you're kind of looking for other models within the region, I would agree with you that there are people who want a far more secular type of state, and those who want something a little closer to a theocratic state. I would say the bulk is in the middle, where they want, as I said, their values, their society, their norms reflected in their governing structure, the same way we do. And it's going to be a different vocabulary than one that we're used to. It will go through, there are illiberal elements to it, but being an Islamist does not make you, by definition, illiberal. And I think that's just this simplification we have to be very careful of, that we don't brand all Islamists as theocratic illiberals, that it's a broad range of players.
Amaney Jamal, you do say that we're headed toward an illiberal order. And if we are in a system, as Thanassis says, of maximal power, I wonder what that means for women who played such a pivotal role in so many of these uprisings. What does the future hold for women in Egypt and beyond?
So again, the situation, the status of women in the Arab world, if we just look at objective indicators, it was doing, on some indicators, the status of women was doing quite well. For example, the literacy gap, at least among the youth population of women, between youth and men was almost closed in the last decade. Levels of education, especially levels of higher education, actually women are outnumbering men. So we've seen a lot of advancements for women. Alongside those advancements, we still see areas that need a lot of improvement. For example, if you look at the percentage of women in the labor force, not only do they lag behind men, but they actually lag behind all other women of the world in the Middle East. So there you get to this question, and you can ask yourself, well, is this about values, or is this about economic opportunities, right? I mean, if we know that the Arab uprisings were induced by this idea that you have high unemployment rates across several of these countries, especially among the youth population that is educated, where the unemployment rate is about 40, 50, 60. Among the Palestinians, it's about 70% right now. women are not going to be able to compete for jobs, especially put on top of that traditional values. They're not going to get those jobs, or at least there are going to be strong norms to encourage them not to apply for those jobs. So again, a lot of what's underlying this is economics. So I want to emphasize the importance of economic development moving forward. And on there, just kind of like to straddle these conversations, Morsi is showing some quote-unquote pragmatism as he negotiates this IMF loan right now. Remember, this is a movement that had mobilized on social justice, mobilized on subsidies, mobilized on employment opportunities for everybody. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood had Egypt believe that they could institute a socialist system of economic redistribution, and now that they're really talking tough reforms with the IMF negotiations. And today, at least on Twitter, reported that there should be an agreement within 5 days. Now, I don't know, but this is going to be very important, right?
Gotta be right.
I mean, Egypt has to move on those reforms, and the Muslim Brotherhood is really involving itself in tough negotiations. So to kind of backpedal on the issue of women, what these levels of pragmatism mean is that there's hope for women, meaning that although, in my opinion, the Muslim Brotherhood has also previously mobilized on packages that would have taken women back, right? So there's some very regressive policies that they were mobilizing on, reducing the marriage age, right? I think right now in Egypt it's about at 16. They're talking about pulling back to 13, which a lot of women's rights groups think is just absolutely a major hit to women in that country. If you look at some of the constitutional debates that were happening before the Constitution was revoked and before Parliament was dismantled and there were going to be no elections, if you monitor those debates, they were talking about lowering the marriage age. They were talking about reducing some of those packages or those reforms that enabled women, for example, the right of divorce. They never implemented them, but they were talking about them. That raises concern, right? The truth of the matter is, when we look at public opinion in Egypt, right? When we sample people in Egypt, there's a lot of support for taking away women's rights, especially among women. So, I mean, again, so this is a big problem. So there's a very strong cultural, patriarchal discourse that has convinced women that they're better off in patriarchal networks than they are through liberal state-sponsored networks. You're going to do better in the patriarchal network in terms of subsistence, opportunities, protections, than you're going to do if you're going to be out there left alone to deal with the state. So this is kind of the dichotomy we're dealing with. How do we get women to remove themselves? And again, I don't want to be, I'm not into social engineering, and I'm not into external intervention, and I'm not saying we should do anything, but the idea is, how do you convince women, if we're just hypothetically speaking, how do you convince women that they're going to be better off with their rights protected from the state than from these very strong patriarchal networks? You need states that can operate to reflect the interests of societies. You need to create jobs. You need to create a legal order that works, right? If a woman can take her husband to court to divorce him, that there's going to be a judge who's going to listen to the case and actually do something about implementing the law, so the rule of law matters. You're going to need a government that is accountable to the people. It's the process of state development and economic development. And until these countries can reform themselves and women can begin to trust the political institutions around them, then the existing cultural patriarchal structures there are all what women have, and they're going to cling on to those until there's an adequate replacement.
If I could just build on what
Amaney was saying, I mean, at USAID's sort of half-century of experience after uprisings around the world, one of the sort of standard things that we expect is backsliding on women and minority rights after uprisings, around the world, wherever it is. Not what we hope for, but it's what we expect and are planning for. So it's, in a sense, not surprising that it's happening here in the Arab world. So it's something that we've expected and been trying to plan for. On the other hand, so it's been very interesting. In a lot of our educational programs and job training programs across the Arab world, we've done extra work in the last 2 years to make sure that, when we were promoting scholarships, that at least, half of the scholarships go to women or half of the job training participants are women. And it's actually been really interesting. We got pushback and said, well, it's actually turning out that We want to, there are more qualified women are applying for the job training programs, more qualified women are applying for the scholarships. Do we have to accept 50% men, or can we go higher? And so we had to actually edit our contracts, but because the expectation initially was that by sort of asking for a 50% quota for women, it was going to be, pushing it up. But it's been the other way around. So it's,
yeah, there's two interesting phenomena, and Amaney mentioned it in part, that we've seen in the Gulf and then in Yemen. A couple of years ago, we started noticing that there were more women in higher education. And the presumption was that we were seeing it in the Gulf universities because the men were all going abroad for education. And then somebody went back and checked the numbers, and no, there's simply more women in higher education in the Gulf states. And this has been going on for at least 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. And there's no expectation or indication that it's going to reverse. At a certain point, not too distant future, they're probably going to come up with their own version of lean in, where you're going to have a critical mass of women who are not just literate, but highly educated. At least among the Gulf nationals themselves, to the not counting Saudi Arabia, to the extent that there's unemployment, it tends to be self-unemployment. It's young men who are sitting around waiting for that government job to show up. She's not. Most of the small and medium-sized enterprises in the Emirates, for example, are owned and run by women. They're not just titular. It's not like having a woman-owned company here where you end up with a government contract. They really do. And so the long term, when you have that level of education, you have that level of technological connection to the outside world, they know what's going on, the change is going to happen. The other small thing is when the Yemenis actually launched their national dialogue, well over 30% of the delegates are women, by statute or by agreement of the technical committee. They have their own committee, their own delegation, and then they have to be 30% of every single other delegation. And nothing can be passed in a working committee unless you have what they call a working consensus of 90%, which means the women's views have to be taken into account. I'm not going to be Panglossian about all of this, but there are structures, there are things that are happening where the women are demanding their participation and will be able to get something out of this. They're not being completely shut out of the process.
Barbara, you mentioned, I'll stay with Yemen for a minute. You mentioned some hopeful developments there. We're not used to hearing anything hopeful about Yemen, and in fact, we're not used to hearing very much at all about Yemen, period.
Yeah.
But I wonder to what extent Yemen could be seen as any kind of model for the rest of the region. You have a situation where there was a transfer of power, and you have a government that now seems to be going after Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula more vigorously than it had previously. What informs both of those things?
Yeah, first, and Bill Burns very nicely gave a shout out to Yemen. And there are an awful lot of interesting and positive things going on there. I do not think that they can be applied to any place else, unfortunately. They're very unique. Yemen has also benefited from the fact that the international media is not paying any attention to it. And so it can kind of work through these issues, make mistakes and everything else, and you don't have the most extreme firebrands showing up on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, sort of skewing the dialogue, with all due respect.
No offense taken.
Yeah, no offense intended, but sometimes being ignored is better. What the Yemenis were able to do, unlike any of the other countries, is that they kind of almost got to the precipice of a real civil war and real violence. And they looked at that precipice and they went, we're not going there. And they walked back, and they had what I call the negotiated revolution. You had dueling declarations from youth and students and women and everything else going on for months and months. And they finally kind of basically negotiated a contract, an implementation plan, 30 pages, where they laid out, how are we going to do this? They negotiated themselves within a box created by the GCC and the UN. And it included the president stepping down. He's still there, but he stepped down. He's really out of power. He doesn't quite know that himself sometimes, but he really...
Always the last to know.
He's really the last one to figure it out, but he really doesn't have a role. He's out of power. There's a consensus president. There's an opposition prime minister. There's a government of national unity. There's this national dialogue going on, which is a fascinating phenomenon. It's 565 Yemenis in one room, basically arguing through what is our social contract. Who are we? What do we want to do? How do we want to set ourselves up? It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. But they're doing this in working groups. Something I think if the Egyptians had done some kind of a dialogue first, and then a constitution, and then an election, as opposed to doing it the other way around, they might be better off. How it's going to come out, I don't know. They've also, and this is where we were talking about this earlier, President Hady the military was powerful, as it often is in these states, and not terribly pro-change, pro-democracy, or pro-liberal. And what Hady did over a year is very slowly pull all the struts out from the major military leaders, sort of all of those support staff. And then about 2 weeks ago, he finally went to the president's son, Ali Mohsen, who's a big player, a number of other of the major military commanders, and said, by the way, you now get to be ambassador to Ethiopia. You get to be on my presidential advisory committee, which mean as much in Yemen as they do here. And when these guys turned around, they realized all of the struts, all of the support was gone. And he very nicely sort of disestablished the military opposition. And the final straw, and for any of you who were around in the late 60s and early 70s, you'll appreciate this. He took the military camp of the biggest problem, Ali Mohsen, and he's turning it into a people's park. And the military camp is just going away. The final insult to Ali Mohsen is, you've lost your power, you've lost your supporters, you've lost your money, and your military camp is gone. I don't think that this is necessarily applicable other places, because you did also have Ali Abdullah, for all of his problems, was willing to negotiate a transfer of power. He did not sit down like Assad and decide to fight his way to power. He didn't need to be thrown out. You need a whole series of very unique characteristics that were in Yemen. So when early in the Syria process, there was a lot of talk about the Yemen model. It only works if the guy in charge is willing to negotiate himself out of a job.
Thanassis, I want to ask you one last question before we open it up to questions from the audience. But I want to ask you whether you think we are finished with seeing new uprisings in the Arab world. There are countries that have seemed particularly impervious to the sorts of uprisings that we've seen in Egypt and Syria. They perhaps are scared off by those experiences. Countries like Jordan and Lebanon, and particularly the monarchies, seem to have been particularly resilient in all of this. Are we likely to see new uprisings in places where we haven't seen anything yet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's anywhere left that we haven't seen anything in, right? I mean, even in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf monarchies, in Jordan, there has been turbulence. I think absolutely Jordan is vulnerable. Palestine is vulnerable. Lebanon probably the least so, because it doesn't, as someone put it very eloquently the other day at AUB, there's no state to rise up against, and there's no regime to topple. But I think all the other countries are vulnerable, and where we're going to see for sure attempted uprisings is Jordan. I think Bahrain will try again, and I think. The Shia area of Saudi Arabia will try again. I think the monarchies have too much money to be toppled by force, and I think that's what we saw in Bahrain. Ultimately, they and Saudi have enough money and enough of an impregnable support base that they will buy and, when necessary, kill their opponents. And I think that's, I wouldn't call that resilience, but I think that's a pretty deep sort of bank account they have to draw on. I don't think Jordan has that. I think Jordan is vulnerable to an uprising because it is a Palestinian majority country that has no economy to speak of, and a king whose security is based on sort of equal weakness with multiple constituencies. And that is, I don't think that is a great long-term recipe for holding on to power. And I think it will be interesting when Jordan falls. I don't think it's going to be that consequential. I have different point of view on this than other people. I think what happens in Egypt and what happens in Syria really matters around the region. I don't think what happens in Yemen matters too much beyond Yemen. In a way, Bahrain as well. What happens in Bahrain, it's so sui generis. It's not an engine of political emulation or exporting political thought. So all these countries matter, in their context. Some of them have much greater regional resonance than others. I think Libya as well. We look at Libya. Libya doesn't resonate beyond Libya very much. So it's fascinating to look at what's happening there. Nobody's gonna look at the Libyan model and have it play. It's not gonna play out in Syria. It's not gonna play out in Egypt or elsewhere. So Egypt and Syria, I think, are really the ones to watch because what happens there spills over, and what happens there shapes politics and political movements elsewhere. I'm betting on Lebanese stability, by the way, because I put my kids in school there.
It's very important to you.
Putting down sod in the yard, and so I'm assuming
You don't want it trampled.
Yeah, no civil war for at least 3 or 4 years.
So let's take some questions. I'll ask that everyone just keep their questions as brief as possible because we are time constrained, and I want to make sure that you all get to lunch on time because I know you're hungry. And please make sure that they are questions. We don't want speeches. We don't want comments. We want questions. Sir.
My name is Javed Khan, and I'm a former diplomat from Pakistan, and alum of Woodrow Wilson School, class of 77. Earlier in the day, we heard from Bill Burns about the role of the United States in the Middle East. And then the question of the day became to intervene or not to intervene. And now we are discussing Arab awakening and what kind of transition governments follow after a change. Somebody mentioned during the day that the role of Islam has been ignored either in our strategy or in any possible change in Middle East. Look at Hamas. After democratic elections, Islamic government emerged, and till today, we have not recognized. Look at Turkey.
Sir, if I could ask you to just ask a question.
So my question is that the role of Islam, which we have regarded only either moderate Islam, which is a good Islam, all other Islam is bad, and particularly with the thought of Islamic Sharia law, if the majority adopts it, whether it's Taliban or others, it's a bad Islam, or the secular forces emerge, they are acceptable to us, all others are not. So what kind of political Islam or role of Islam is acceptable to United States, even if it is voted democratically by majority of the people, whether it's
Amaney Jamal,
Egypt or...
What do you think
Yeah,
about it?
well, the title of my most recent book, and not to plug my book, but if it's outside, all the better, is pro-American democracy or no democracy at all, right? So it's, the argument that I put forward that if we look at the involvement of the U.S. in the region, it's not only this fear of Islamism. Remember, Jamal Abdel Nasser was the chief secularist of the countries. He wasn't pro-American, and he was no friend of the United States either. So this idea that, if we had secular leaders in power, it would resolve America's anxieties, that is very false, right? The issue is the policies. Moderate Islamists, this moderate project has come to encompass any movement that is going to be willing to work with the United States. Then the not moderates or everybody else is not willing to work with the United States. So the idea is what we look for in terms of partners in the region are pro-American Democrats or no democracy or no Democrats at all. And Hamas it's a very unfortunate situation with Hamas. I mean, many people argued at the time of the Hamas election, had Europe and the United States not isolated Hamas, Hamas could have possibly been on a road of reform.
Sure.
I will defer because I think that you got there before me.
Please.
No, please, go ahead.
No, I insist.
Please.
Okay, ladies first.
Ladies first.
Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. I wanted to make a comment and ask a question. I'm a bit troubled with the characterization of the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization that is out for power now and divorced of ideology. I mean, I think that to sort of remind us, as Ambassador Crocker mentioned in the break, let's not become too ahistorical. I mean, the Brotherhood, which has a long history in Egypt, is now in power. It is functioning in many different roles, not only as a political entity, it's still a social and religious movement. So I think that let's not become too oversimplistic by characterizing it as simply, this is all about a power grab. It's a lot about religion, it's a lot about ideology, and that's what's being sorted out in Egypt. Given this context, I wanted to ask Ambassador Bodine, you raised a very important point, which is how can the United States affect the behavior or the ideas, the evolving ideas of some of the many, many Islamist groups? And I think the Salafists are a very good example of that. Recently, a few weeks ago, when I was in Egypt and met many of the Salafist leaders, they very much want to engage the United States. And I think that this is a very rare opportunity that the United States has now, and the window may close as they become more involved in the political process, as they develop their own stakeholders in Egyptian society. So how can the United States at this moment, very important moment, try to engage some of the Salafists, which are becoming a lot more important, not only in Egypt, but Yemen, Lebanon, and other countries in the region? Thank you.
I'll let Hady answer this in part two.
Thank you.
Why don't you go ahead?
No, you go
I'll-
ahead.
Okay.
Ladies first-
This has gotta
ladies
be
first
kind of
again.
The most polite group
No,
of
no,
people.
please,
You go
please.
first. Thank you first. I think you bring up an excellent fact, which gets kind of ignored here, is that Islamists, and we're going to use the very broad definition from Salafists all the way through, are not implacably opposed to working with us, and in many cases do reach out to us. And the question is, are we willing to step up and work with them? And in a number of places we have. It's not a secret in the region, it's kind of a secret here, that, for example, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, both of whom operate with a lot of U.S. government money, spend a lot of time working with Islamist political players. It can be Islah in Yemen, it can be the Islamists in the Kuwaiti parliament, Bahrain, Jordan, and Morocco, other places. When we are doing projects with women, with youth, with entrepreneurs, in a sense, we don't check, their religious affiliation coming in the door. I'd like to underscore the point that secularists are not always our friends. I would add Saddam Hussein and the Assads to that as well, so we have to be careful. So we have reached out and worked with these groups in the past, and I would hope that we would continue to have a nuanced approach to when we're doing programs on civil society, on all of this stuff, that it would include those Islamists of the whole broad spectrum who are willing to work with us. That should be sort of the criteria number one. And that we don't get into this false sort of secular Islamist, good guys, bad guys thing, because we will be painting ourselves into a really stupid corner.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, and I'm not inherently a friend to Islamists. My family is composed of Jews and Catholics and Sunnis and Shia. We're a very diverse family. But the central tenet of our work at USAID and sort of flowing from U.S. policy is that we engage with religious leaders across the Middle East to the extent that they have sort of eschewed violence and sort of embraced basic democratic principles. And as long as that is the case, for the most part, we engage with religious leaders Islamists and the like throughout the region. They do participate in the programming that we fund. And we have a litmus test on ties to terrorism. We do not have litmus tests on values beyond sort of eschewing violence and beyond sort of a commitment to democracy. So that's our approach.
Sir, and just a reminder, brief questions because we got very little time.
Okay, I'm going to start by violating your edict. I was a mid-career fellow a long time ago, and after that I worked in Yemen. And I would like just to say one thing about Yemen, which sounds like a bumper sticker but needs to be thought about. Was said by a wise AID official who was there, that the Yemenis are very good at conflict resolution because they are very poor at conflict avoidance. And I think that what Ambassador Bodine said was, and I think that other countries could take a lesson from them. My question, however, is about the Egyptian army. I read recently in a journal I respect that the reason the army stepped aside and didn't stop supporting Mubarak was that they feared that the company-grade officers, NCOs, and troops would not fire on the protesters if that were to happen. That obviously would have been a grave setback for the leadership. But the question generally is, the Egyptian army was considered to have, to put it mildly, a dominant position in Egyptian society, politics, and above all, economics. Whither the Egyptian army? Thank you.
Thanassis?
So the Egyptian army still has a dominant position in their economic holdings, which are, there's no precise accounting of it, but the estimates range from 10 to 40% of the Egyptian economy controlled by the military. We know they have bottled water factories, refrigerator factories, olive trees, plantations, construction companies. I mean, they really have a huge chunk of the economy. What happened to after the army took over from Mubarak, they proved to be of middling competence in running the country. I mean, this was what, aside from the fact that we might have a value judgment about should they be running the country directly, they weren't as good at it as they thought they would be. So by the time they turned over power to an elected president, it was as much an admission that it wasn't working out for them to actually be the presidency. However, that wasn't a surrender of power. And there was a brief showdown between Morsi and the military, and I think this gets misunderstood a lot. What happened in August of last year was that the men who had run the sort of coup period or the SCAF period, Tantawi and Sami Anan, widely loathed by the mid-level officer corps, old men who had been hogging the top positions for a long time, were negotiated out of power. And what happened, it wasn't Morsi decapitating the army. What it was Morsi going to different guys in the senior leadership of the army and saying, will you cooperate with me if I fire these guys and give you the defense ministry? He didn't put an outsider in charge. He put an insider in charge who was willing to tolerate a Muslim Brotherhood presidency. And the man who took over, al-Sisi, comes from military intelligence. And for Egypt watchers, I mean, these are known quantities. This guy has all the files. And by the way, he does not share them with the civilian presidency. There was an incident which I think has been reported by now where after August of last year, Sisi invited the president to come and see the files on the Sinai and a few other sensitive matters, and he said, you can bring one person with you. And Morsi showed up with a troop of advisors, about a dozen guys, and Sisi just canceled the meeting. That was it. He said, I'm not going to show you this stuff. And that's where it's remained. And the balance of power, it's not completely delineated, but there is no supposition that the civilian presidency is now subordinating the military under its control. Now the question is, how much of an active veto power does the army have over what the government does? I'm not sure it has much in the day-to-day specifics. I'm not sure that a general can call up a member of the cabinet and say, I don't like what you're putting in this draft of the Constitution, I want you to change it. But the things that they wanted got rammed in there. I mean, the inviolable privilege of the military to govern its own affairs was put in the Constitution, and that was part of the deal whereby Morsi got to fire Tantawi and put Sisi in charge, and Sisi said, I'll go for this, but you keep our prerogatives, and those have remained.
I wonder if any members of the panel are able to comment on the role of Turkey. You know, almost a century ago, they were the first great example of an Islamic country moving toward liberalism, and where Kemal Ataturk said the country can only modernize and prosper if you reject theocracy and become a secular state. My years at NATO, they were a very positive member of the Western Alliance. It's my impression that since then they have become less secular, and this may have caused problems for U.S. policy in, say, in Iraq, and maybe dealing with Turkey since then. But I'm not sure of that. I'll be interested in any comments you may have.
I'll give some, at least again, the view from my side. Yes, Turkey has shifted to kind of redefine its national narrative to try to bring Turkish identity and Islam together, very far short of any kind of a theocracy. It's more of a rethinking of personal identity and national narrative. We still continue to cooperate very closely with Turkey within NATO. They're still a very good friend of ours. The new foreign policy, which I think is misunderstood sometimes in this country, is not that they've turned their back on the West, but they've got kind of a 360 foreign policy now. And I think that there are increasing evidence that this actually serves our interest. The Turks have become very active in the region in ways that are primarily supportive. They're very active in terms of soft power or smart power, investment. The amount of investment of Turkey in Iraq, which is critical to Iraq surviving and providing a counterbalance to Iranian influence, absolutely critical. The last time I was in Yemen, I was at the Movenpick Hotel, and it was me and 300 Turks. And it was a government delegation, and then a lot of businessmen, lots of businessmen. So they are getting engaged. They're still kind of feeling their way, exactly how they want to do it, but they can be a very good partner. Not necessarily, again, I don't like models, I don't like templates, but they are a state that has proven that you can be a democracy, have an Islamic identity, have relations pretty much 360, and that, at least as a demonstration effect, if not a template, is very positive.
What are the values of Islam that the Islamists believe are not shared by the Western democracies? And I think it's important to have an answer to that, because so-called Islamic values underpins so much of the rhetoric, and it would also be very helpful for those on the outside looking in, particularly policymakers, to know what the Islamic political leaders and the body politic over there thinks about when they invoke Islamic values.
Okay.
You know, that's a really good question, and it's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, because when I ask myself, what are these Islamic values that yes, the Ikhwan, the Islamist movements are ideological. They mobilize, their ideologies mobilize on a certain platform which calls for Sharia or Islamic law. But the truth is, if we take the constitution of Islamic law or Sharia, there is no unified constitution that is Islamic law or Sharia. So this whole campaign to get rid of Sharia in the United States perplexes me, because I don't understand what they're really mobilizing against. There's no one constitution of Islamic law. The constitution of Islamic law in Iran is different than the Islamic constitution of law in Saudi Arabia, and it's certainly different than what we have in Turkey. So again, it's not clear. We could argue and say, well, there's these core tenets of Islam that come out of the Quran, and these, of course, are what the Muslim Brotherhood wants. But the truth is, if you look at what they used as their platform to mobilize, at least before they came to power, what they were talking about were things about sovereignty, ridding their country of imperialism, or basically being that client state. They were talking about economic justice, social justice, anti-corruption, anti-authoritarianism, pro-democracy, transparency, accountability. I mean, they were, in many ways, and I don't know if, Hady would agree. They very much resemble the USAID type of mission statement, right? They were everything the existing regime wasn't. And now they have to rule. And now, the ball's in their court, and it's not clear what they're going to do. Now, is there anything about the Morsi government that might worry me because they're Islamist? I mean, we go to the obvious candidates: women, minorities. But the truth is, we haven't really seen these horrific. Again, I'm worried, I'm concerned, I'm skeptical. Maybe I've been socialized to be so. But we really haven't seen these movements against minorities or against women that are raising, the alarms. So, what will an Islamic democratic government in Egypt look like? It might look like Turkey, right? I don't think it's going to look like Saudi Arabia. And I know I didn't answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, it's a shame that the lack of clarity.
And it's not going to look like Iran.
Not going to be Iran, not going to be Saudi.
Look, it's problematic to talk about an Islamic thing because it's so heterogeneous. But when we talk about the specifics, like the Ikhwan in Egypt, there's plenty of evidence. We don't need to be vague. I mean, they actually have proposed legislation that I think is horrible for Egypt, and that many Egyptians think is horrible for themselves, that has to do with stripping away the ability of courts to grant people due process, that does erode women's rights, that does erode minority rights. And it's not, I think, I'm not sure if I fully got what you meant there. I think we actually, a year ago, I was defending the Muslim Brotherhood against people's assumptions about what they would do. Now, unfortunately, I think we have a legislative and executive track record that's horrifying, and it's not more horrifying than that of secular fascists or of Salafis, but they're the ones in power, and they've done a lot of things that are
right. No, but I think it's important to just keep things in perspective. Yes, they've tried to propose legislation, but they've backpedaled. If anything Morsi has done, he's consistently backpedaled. He announced he was going to reduce the subsidies. Within 24 hours, he retracted. They announced this very conservative women's rights package. They stalled. So they're not coherent in what they're doing.
And overnight, they pushed through a constitution that included a very vague but deleterious provision for clerical oversight of legislation. That's in the Constitution.
Okay, so that's probably in the Constitution. So, but nevertheless, we're seeing a lot of negotiation going on. I'm not trying to defend them, no. I'm just saying it's not clear where they're going to come out on this.
Saying there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty in discussing Islamic values.
I'm not sure
I didn't get that one.
We have time for one more question.
Well, thank you so much, panelists. It was brilliant. My question goes into U.S. foreign interest in the Middle East, in the outcome of the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening or whatever you want to call it. Since the end of the Second World War, there's been a battle between U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East based on principles and interests. Mm-hmm. And we always see that interest prevails simply because of our oil interests or security interests or stability interests in the region. Mm-hmm. And so my question goes into, since we are seeing the biggest backers of U.S., the allies of U.S. in the region, Bin Ali, Mubarak, who were dictators backed for decades by the U.S., falling like dominoes. Is there a sense within the foreign policy interests of the U.S. to shift its perspective and scope, looking at what will be the other dominoes? What I'm trying to get into is Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf Arab countries. We know it's a ticking bomb. It's going to happen. The Arab Spring cannot stop by the borders of the Levant. So the point is, will the American foreign interest and policy change from supporting those in palaces to the pulse of the nation in the society, which actually seeks democratic change, whatever that means for them? But are we going to stop supporting these dictatorial rules and then apply it equally on the society and what they want as representation?
Barbara, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. I think there is, and Bill Burns talked about this morning, any state has a balance between some of its basic interests, its strategic interests, if you like, and its values. I do think that it's a topic that we debate far more in this country than I've seen in some other places. And the fact that it's a constant debate is good. If you look at the national security strategy, which I'm sure you all have on your bedside table, it has three sets of interests. There's strategic security, there's economic, and then there's values, principles. And it goes through each of those, and when it talks about security, it doesn't just talk about military security. It's more than that. It's environmental security, economic security, all of this. On economics, it's creating trade, it's also creating jobs. And then on the values, which I think it's always been a core part of our policy, not always trying to figure out exactly how to do it. But I think one of the things that I've seen with particularly this administration is it's tried to grapple with the Arab awakening, uprising, upheaval, spring, winter, fall, is how do we square that a little bit better with the fundamental understanding that I certainly agree with, is that our interests will be ultimately guaranteed if these are more stable states. And these states will be more stable if they have better, I don't know what an ideal political system is. You get to a place like Bahrain and it gets, we've got a major naval thing there. So I'm not saying that we always come out with, the grand principle. But I think the longer term, the idea that we will do better if these states are better governed is something where you start squaring the security interest and the values.
Would that
I
apply
think
to the
particularly,
Persian Gulf countries?
and particularly in the Gulf countries, this is a conversation we've been having with the Gulf countries for a long time. It's nothing new. I think if you look at the Gulf countries, I disagree with anyone who's ever heard me that their stability is simply a matter of money. I find that insulting to the Gulf Arabs themselves, that they are so passive they can be just bought off. There is a legitimacy to some of these regimes, but they do need to continue to open. They do need to, and we work on this. I know AID is very active in this. Pushing for a change in government that is so dramatic that it is destabilizing and causes chaos, which is not good for the people there. Ask the Iraqis, friends, see Iraq, close friend. How do you push evolutionary organic change at a pace maybe faster than some people are comfortable with, but not so fast that you're overturning apple carts, because that's not in our interest either. And that's kind of the role of diplomats, State Department, USAID, and everyone else, is how far do you push? When the Emiratis, for example, seem to be cracking down more on dissidents than before, how do you engage on that? And have that dialogue that your survival as a regime, your survival as a state, our national security interests are tied to our values, to these universal values of better governance, participation, and all the other things that Bill Burns ran through. That's, I think, the challenge.
We'll leave it there. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you.
I'm going to ask everyone to please help clear out this room. So if